faux half, whatever, octo. Congratulations to both teams for making it smart, actually. We've got Griffith on the app, and well played, and you are on the neg, and if I'm correct, we're debating the second topic about the Catholic Church, known as splitting babies. Brilliant. Alright, well, if there's no usual time is between 1 cup and 6 and 2 at 8, if there's no further questions, we will invite the first speaker of the Affirmative team, Peter, to speak to the motion of
Madam Speaker, we know from the investigations which have occurred in Australia, in the Americas, all around the world, we know from the thousands of the complaints which have been levelled against the Catholic Church, only 6% of which have resulted in charges actually being brought against clergymen. We know from prominent human rights lawyers like Jeffrey Robertson, publishing books like The Case Against the Catholic Church, that the Catholic Church has now, for generations, been committing abuses such as sexual assault and pedophilia by clergymen against children, and they have been systematically covering up these abuses through methods of confidential agreements and settlements, Madam Speaker. That is why there has been no greater social prosecution of the Church. That is why these abuses continue not to be prosecuted, and that is why these abuses have continued for generation after generation, Madam Speaker. We say that every individual who has witnessed these abuses, who has accepted money and been gutless, instead of standing up and opposing these abuses, Madam Speaker, who has accepted money to be silent, Madam Speaker, shares in the moral culpability of these crimes which were committed and continue to be committed throughout the world, Madam Speaker. We say they share their culpability, and it's about time we say that is wrong. We say that almost 100% of the time, these sorts of confidential settlements have requirements for confidentiality, Madam Speaker, which means that evidence can never be brought forward in the future. We've seen this in cases where Father Capello, for example, has actually sued his victim for breaking that confidentiality agreement, Madam Speaker, making that victim relive the trauma of dealing with that particular individual and that particular perpetrator, Madam Speaker, giving that perpetrator all the power and all the rights in that situation, Madam Speaker. We say that the results of these sorts of confidential agreements means that these priests often just move to other parishes and atoned by the Church for their sins. They're never brought before the justice of man, Madam Speaker, before the justice of our law, Madam Speaker. We say that is wrong. This is not a debate about a model or a policy. This is a debate about the people who made that decision, whether or not they were morally culpable in the decision-making calculus that they had. With that in mind, Madam Speaker, I will be making 2 arguments. Firstly, why the parents' actions were selfish and morally culpable in circumstances, and secondly, why the parents in those circumstances were not able to make decisions on behalf of their children and on behalf of the future children and future victims of these crimes, Madam Speaker. So why these parents' actions were selfish and morally culpable? Well, we say, first of all, on the simplest level, they sacrificed justice in exchange for money, Madam Speaker. We say that is fundamentally gutless, and we say that denies the victims the justice that occurs. That denies the victims the ability to go to trial and to make the accusations against those perpetrators, Madam Speaker. That denies the victims' ability to have their story told, Madam Speaker, and to have that recognised by society, Madam Speaker. And fundamentally, that denies the victims the ability to take that suffering and to take that trauma and turn it into something positive, into a social good, Madam Speaker. That is what the parents have given away, Madam Speaker. But the second thing we tell you, Madam Speaker, is that the thing that motivated these parents in the first place is the fact that they wanted to keep standing within their religious community, Madam Speaker. The fact that these people were often the parents of Catholic school children or Catholic altar boys and those sorts of things, Madam Speaker, means that they were fundamentally invested in maintaining their standing within that church, Madam Speaker. We think that fundamentally those motivations and those push factors came into play in these decision-making calculuses rather than going to the courts, Madam Speaker. We say that is very, very important. The third thing we say is that these parents knew full well that what those priests did were wrong, Madam Speaker. There is no religious justification for these acts by the Church, Madam Speaker. The Scriptures tell us that pedophilia is wrong, Madam Speaker. The Catholic Scriptures tell us that sexual abuse is wrong, Madam Speaker. There is no way in which, under the guise of the Church and under the guise of the institution, they could accept that to be a correct statement. They have chosen to accept standing within that institution, Madam Speaker, rather than following the moral convictions of that religion and those religious teachings, Madam Speaker. We say they know full well that those actions were wrong, and yet they chose to accept them and not bring them to trial. The fourth thing we say is that, like, the reason this was selfish is because they maintained their reputation as a parent. These parents did not want to be associated with, like, letting their kids around pedophiles and letting their kids hang out with people who are dangerous to those sorts of things. We think that that has repercussions for the parents, and that was a push factor in making those parents shy away from these prosecutions, Madam Speaker. And what we say is, like, finally, we also know that these parents should have been or would be well aware that the court protects victims in these circumstances. We don't think that, like, the fact, we know that the courts, like, do things like protecting the victim's identity and making sure that, like, they can give evidence in secret in cases of sexual abuse, Madam Speaker. So we don't think that that was a motivating factor of the parents. We think that these motivating factors were not altruistic at all. These motivating factors were entirely selfish, and therefore they share in that moral culpability. So why we think the parents did not have the right to make decisions? Firstly, based on their own children. Secondly, based on their future children. And thirdly, based on society. So why didn't they have rights to make decisions on behalf of their own children? Well, we say that fundamentally victims have a right to seek justice. That's why we have the justice system in the first place. There should never be a barrier to that justice system. To the extent that we allow parents to make some decisions in society, we do not allow parents to make those decisions when that decision harms that particular child. So we see this in situations such as, like, Jehovah's Witnesses parents not being allowed to, like, restrict their children's access to medicine, Madam Speaker. It's the same thing, they're not allowed to restrict their children's access to justice. Like, if they want to go and get an abortion, they can get court approval to override parental consent and issues like that, Madam Speaker. We see that there's never been a barrier of parental consent for access to justice, Madam Speaker. We don't think that children should be bound to those confidentiality agreements that their parents sign on their behalf as a roadblock to that justice. But the second stakeholder we see in this debate, because we know that sexual assault has one of the highest recidivism rates of any sort of crime, Madam Speaker. They have the highest repetition and those sorts of things. And we've seen thousands of examples of priests who have recommitted offences, because it's not just been one child, it's been 2, 3, 4, 5 over the course of decades and decades between parishes, Madam Speaker. So we say that those parents sharing the moral culpability of the crimes committed against every future victim of that particular priest, Madam Speaker. We don't think that just you, as the individual parent, have the right to make that decision on behalf of all of those future victims, Madam Speaker. You have the culpability to bring that person to justice when you can. We think that when you become a parent, you recognise that children are a vulnerable group within society, and you have that responsibility, not only on your own child, but on the greater childhood as a whole, Madam Speaker. And we say that the second level this occurs on is the fact that you're a member of a Catholic community, Madam Speaker. You're a member of a community that is meant to care for each other and to have responsibility over those other people. And to the extent that all these victims are Catholics and within that community, we think the parents have culpability over the future victims within that community. The third stakeholder we want to talk about in this today is the social prosecution, Madam Speaker, because we think there's been all sorts of bars to justice on the international prosecution of the Catholic Church, the international investigation. The Catholic Church has been able to claim things like sovereign immunity to protect evidence from getting out, Madam Speaker. They've been able to move people between countries to protect them from being investigated, Madam Speaker. They've been able to exercise all this international influence and all this international power, which has stopped the ability to think. We think that fundamentally we recognise as a legal principle that when you, like, cover up evidence of a large prosecution, you're aiding and abetting in that particular crime. You're allowing that crime to occur. And you're allowing the future crimes to occur, which is what the status quo has always allowed. Has always allowed those priests to be moved into another parish. Has always allowed those priests to not stand trial, to not be brought to justice, and to continue having complaints. That is why complaints are still being made today, despite the fact we knew that 50 years ago, 100 years ago, these sorts of abuses were systematic within the church, Madam Speaker. We say that that's fundamentally harmful. We say that when you cover up that evidence, when you sign those confidentiality agreements, you prevent the ability for that greater prosecution and that greater social ability to investigate and charge that Catholic Church, Madam Speaker. What have I told you in this debate? I told you this debate has taken place in the context where only 6% of complaints actually ever have charges brought against the Catholic Church, Madam Speaker. This debate takes place in the context where people understand their actions and the parents act in selfish motivations, Madam Speaker, knowing full well the harms of those sorts of things. We say that they're morally culpable. They were selfish in what they did, Madam Speaker. They did not have the ability to make those decisions on behalf of the children, on behalf of all the future victims of these priests, and on behalf of society, Madam Speaker. We proudly propose.
And we'll now welcome the first speaker from the negative team, Shane, to open their case.
Madam Chair, if parents parents chose to stay silent to protect the Catholic Church, we would have a problem with that. But their choice is driven not by that, but by the moral duty to protect their child. Their hand should not be forced by the nebulous political benefits of what no one knows will happen to the Catholic Church and that structure later on. Neither the affirmative team nor the state should force parents to offer up their child as a sacrificial lamb in a legal battle that is not theirs to fight. Moreover, we think that if the state wanted to fight this, they should have started a royal commission on this 20 years ago. The state's failure to act and to shut down this harm does not then transfer that duty to other individual and private actors in this case. A few points of rebuttal. Firstly, they told us that people who didn't act were gutless and selfish. But we say this: it doesn't matter how much guts you have as a parent, because your guts don't matter in this case. It's not you, but your 3-year-old who will be drugged, or who will be dragged through that harmful trial and whose life will be harmed to the greatest extent in this case. They told us secondly, we say, that it's not your duty, because it's not your duty, because only by chance have you been hit by this abuse. No one else in society is afforded this same burden, but just because you've been abused in this way, you're randomly allocated this burden by the lottery of that abuse. And finally, we say that it's a rational choice to take money, because money can offer things like counseling to children, like the ability to move away from a harmful and oppressive society, and we think that's a logical choice in today's debate. Secondly, they told us that the court protects the identity of its victims. Firstly, we say that's empirically untrue, especially with the long and drawn-out nature of these trials, especially in the environments of these trials, in enclosed religious communities like Northern Ireland. And secondly, what we say is that while the court may try to do that, the church often disseminates your identity in in different ways, and sometimes the identity gets out, and we can't guarantee against it. Thirdly, they say that we have a duty to future victims. The logic behind that point goes, I don't start out with a moral duty as a member of society, but just because by chance abuse has happened to me, I not only have to deal with that abuse, I now also have to deal with a moral duty to everyone else in society. That logic doesn't make sense when I don't know who else will act upon that duty, when I don't know the effect and benefits that me acting on that duty will bring. That logic just doesn't make sense. And finally, they told us that the Catholic Church has some sort of international immunity when it comes to dealing with these crimes. We say that if they have international immunity, if they have the ability to avoid some damage and transfer priests to different jurisdictions, then it's harder to know as a parent what effect my choice to sacrifice up my child will have in the bigger environment, and that removes the moral duty in that way. 3 substantive points. Firstly, why there are rational moral reasons for parents to refuse to expose their children to a public trial. Secondly, why children aren't tools of a public fight against sexual abuse, but even if they were, why they wouldn't be effective ones. And thirdly, why parents making this decision, as opposed to children making this decision, actually strengthens our case. Firstly, why there are rational moral reasons for parents to refuse this. We say that children have a right to privacy on the issue of abuse, just like anyone else. We would love a world where private trials could happen, but that doesn't exist in the modern day. We say that parents have a choice of 3 things. They could either opt into a full public trial, they could have private settlements like what we're suggesting, or sometimes they could have public settlements. We say that public settlements aren't often available because the motivation of having a settlement in the first place is taken away at the point where you reveal that, and the Catholic Church doesn't want to offer these settlements. We say that if you live in Northern Ireland, which is a majority Catholic community, that people often protect their own, and often there's huge social backlash to you revealing the identity of that child in that way. We think that the obligation of breaking this oppressive nexus doesn't fall to you, but falls to the state. And there's no logical moral reason why it would fall to you just because you've been abused. But furthermore, we say that abuse isn't part of the public domain. There's no right of anyone else to know about your abuse. That's an intensely private and personal issue that you choose whether to reveal or not because it's part of your identity. Because it can lead to things like public ostracization. It can lead to things like you being kicked out of your school. It can lead to things like all your friends in that circle rejecting you and forcing you out and bullying you in that way. But furthermore, we say this. We say that it's perfectly rational for adults to opt into private settlements. So for instance, if you're the victim of a harassment case against a big corporation, it's perfectly rational if we let you opt into private settlements. We say that these cases and these issues are not the public domain, but always in the private domain. Finally, we said that there are huge advantages to a private settlement. We think that it gives you a definitive guarantee of some money and some resource. And often, when poor families are hit by this trial, we think that it allows them to guarantee things like buying psychological help for their children. It allows things like to move them away from that particular school and that particular oppressive nexus that they're currently being forced to live in. We think that sometimes this guarantees the most important thing to parents, and they should be allowed to make that choice. We think it's logical and rational for parents to make this choice. Secondly, why children aren't tools of the public fight against sexual abuse. We think that any moral framework that demands children to be used as tools, to be thrown against the monolithic Catholic Church in the hope that it cracks somehow, isn't a good moral framework, and it's something that we fight against in this debate. We think that even if it was true that potentially in future it would serve others, we think that it is morally abhorrent prima facie to use children in that way. Especially because it's the parents of these children who are using them as tools. We think that strict utilitarianism is unapplicable because it denies the rights of children that have happened right now for some nebulous potential benefit in the future. But secondly, we say that you can't translate the culture of silence to the moral flaws of a specific parent. We say that you can't be held accountable for, morally, not using your kid as a tool in this way. Because you can't know what other parents will do. Because you can't know the results of any one of those many, many court trials around the world. You can't know the effects of your action in that way. We think that you can't blame collective actions problems on individual people because they are collective action problems. We don't think that makes sense morally. And we say that you can't blame any single parent for a culture of silence which involves more than just them and the state. We think that when I, as a parent, choose to protect my child, it doesn't make it my fault that other children are abused in future, and you shouldn't force the blame on parents in that way. But finally, we say this. Even if children were tools, and even if parents were responsible for the decisions of other parents in future, we would question the efficacy of your model. We would say that an increased number of reports wouldn't fix the problem, because in the case of Northern Ireland, we saw these reports. We knew of hundreds of cases of physical abuse, but still there was a culture of silence after 15 to 20 years. Still, nothing changed. There were no cracks that were happening in that case. But also, if the norm was what the Affirmative was proposing, we think that the norm was that you had to go to a public trial and report your abuse and report your identity. We think that a lot of people would just choose not to take any action at all. They would choose to stay silent and protect the identities of their children. Finally, why parents making this decision strengthens their position, our position. Firstly, we say that we have no moral problem with adults choosing to settle things in private. We say that that moral stance is actually strengthened when you're making that on behalf of a child. Because while we have no problems with adults being brave, standing up in public, and sacrificing some of their private life for a bigger fight and some humanitarian cause, we say that the opposite is true of parents. Because just because you're a brave, atheist, and oppositional parent who's willing to risk your life in that way, you can't say the same about your child. You can't transfer your braveness onto that child and hope that they don't hate you in the long run. We say that your number one priority as a parent is to insulate and protect your child against any of the harms that would come through a long and harrowing trial. We say that even in future, even at the best case of the opposition, if children might say themselves in future that they want they would have wanted to be a battering ram of society in that way, you can't tell at this point which children would want to do that, which children would be willing to sacrifice their childhood, especially because children can't know the harrowing effects that it would have on them in this way. In conclusion, we think that children, even if benefits came out of your model, cannot be used as tools, they cannot be used as hammers of the state to try and take down the Catholic Church. We oppose.
And we'll now welcome Josh, the second speaker for the Affirmative.
We never contended on the side of the house that it was not going to be a rational choice for parents to make this decision. What we told you is that on the moral calculus about what decision they should make in the very difficult circumstance in which they find out that their child has been a victim of pedophilia, they do one of two things. They either choose to help the state, to help their child, and to help the future victims of pedophilia to fight that pernicious culture that exists, or they choose to actively help the Catholic Church by stepping in this instance and to help perpetuate that culture of silence that Shane himself wanted to discuss. Because what we tell you is there is no distinction between an act or an omission in this debate. They cannot stand here and say that they are not morally culpable because they do not know what will happen to a pedophile in the future. What we tell you is that they make an active choice to do one of two things. Either they fight or they take money, Madam Speaker, in order to remain silent. Both of those are active things that help, one of two actors. We say helping the Catholic Church, given all of the knowledge that they tell us that parents have, is an abhorrent moral decision. That's what we stand for on this side of the house. I'm going to talk about two broad things. I'm going to talk about what's best for the victim and how the parent's relationship plays with that. I'm going to talk about the parent's religious identity and why it is that, to the extent that moral culpability with regards to religion plays in this debate, why it is bad for them as a religious actor to make the decision they made. But firstly, a couple of points of outstanding rebuttal. Firstly, on characterization. Most of their analysis predicated itself on the fact that the parents lose out in this debate at the point in which things like their reputation is harmed, like being involved in the church is harmed. But we told you two things at Pete's speech. The first thing we told you is that the parents are not the victims in this debate, it is their children who are the victims in this debate. So parents, we told you, are not able to trade off their own responsibilities for that of the victims getting served. But the second thing they told us but we think that it's totally rational for every individual to take something to stay silent when it comes to pedophilia. We tell you firstly, we think that every victim of pedophilia should make the decision to come forward and fight in the trial, which is the subject of this debate, because ultimately it's beneficial for themselves, but ultimately it's beneficial for the future generations who no longer have to suffer those continuous acts. But we told you it's worse in the context of the Catholic Church. Firstly, because they've actively taken money in exchange for remaining silent when they might otherwise have come forward. But secondly, because they are aware uniquely of the situations that occur within that church. That changes the calculus, Madam Speaker. Then they tell us, but the state should be the person stepping in this debate. Firstly, we say that the role of the state and what they might otherwise have done play no role in the moral consideration that is the context of this debate. Secondly, we tell you to the extent that it could, you have stopped the state being able to prosecute people, guys, because you've taken away their evidence to be able to launch things like a royal inquiry. To be able to do those things that requires widespread and systemic evidence of, acts occurring. You stop people coming forward, you stop that evidence coming forward. That made no sense. Let's talk about what's best for the victim. On the objective decision, right, about whether or not the victim loses out, they told us the child would be bullied and that the child would have to face a public hearing. That was never going to be true in this debate, Madam Speaker. When we're talking about trials with regards to children, we have all sorts of incredibly advanced defences to make sure that identity is not known. Right? We do not release the identity of children. We do not make them face their accusers. That was never going to hold true in this debate. But most of this analysis actually stood for the parents, right? They told us the parent would have to leave the church and that their religious identity would be told. What we told you at a second level, Madam Speaker, is that it is a subjective decision that they're being made, right? And they bought into this. We told you that parents do not have the ability to be able to trade off their own benefits, Madam Speaker, for that of the victims getting compensation. They told us that parents need to be able to continue to work. They told us in Northern Ireland it's incredibly difficult to come forward because people rally around against it. We say parents should make that decision to stand for their child rather than their own reputation. We think that is a correct moral decision to make. They told us that the child's reputation would be hurt. We say, Madam Speaker, that children best benefit, and all of the evidence that we've heard out of victim theories have told us that they need a couple of things that come out in trials. They need to know that it's not their fault. When you have a trial, you put somebody else on the stand and you accuse them for that trial. They never get that when the Catholic Church is saying what happened was just a thing. The victim never is able to be told that what happened to them was something that should not happen to them. That is wrong. We need a trial to be able to make that occur. The second thing that it does, though, is it shows the victim that what happened to them was not in vain. That this person was persecuted. That future generations of victims are not going to be further hurt by virtue of them standing aside and doing nothing. And let's be clear, just because a parent makes a choice in this debate does not mean that the victim, when they grow older, will not feel morally culpable for future victims as they come forward and get hurt. We think that they will share that blame, Madam Speaker. That is abhorrent that the parents would put that on the child. That was disgusting. We told you furthermore, Madam Speaker, that the parent is not the correct actor to make this decision. Because the parent is not the victim in this debate, Madam Speaker. The child of the parent is a victim in this debate. So we said, all objectivity aside, it is the parent should be making a decision on behalf of the child. Now they tell us that the child is best served by being silent. We question that, Madam Speaker, at the point at which we told you the parents make the decisions based on a couple of things. They make it based on financial gain, right? They tell us that the Catholic Church gives them money in exchange for silence. We think that's pretty telling to parents, right? At the point at which they are not allowed to come forward with their claim. We think it tells those parents that the Catholic Church is not acting in a religious way. So it's the religious identity of parents that they want to talk about in this debate. We say they undermine that very religious identity at the point in which they are facilitating an organisation that purports to help that church, but does nothing to actually help the tenets of the religion that underpin that church. But we told you that there is a broad social level. We told you that they have a positive obligation on the next child who becomes a victim of that pedophile. Because they are within that organisation, Mr. Speaker, they are aware of how that church works. They know that they know that there will be other victims, and that priest will continue going on to be a priest, and that they will be forgiven only in the eyes of the Lord. We told you that was disgusting. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about them on their religious identity. Because even on their best material, they tell us that parents want to trade off because it's better for their religious roles. We tell you a couple of things. Firstly, when they take money in exchange for remaining silent on an abuse of the church, we say they give a power to an organisation that no longer matches up with the moral underpinnings and the tenets of that church. If they want to say that you're a good Catholic if you take this money, that is wrong. We know this for a fact because it is very clear in the Bible that pedophilia is illegal. It's very clear in the Bible, moreover, Mr. Speaker, that you have an obligation over other people in mankind, right? If that's not true for broad society, it's definitely true for the other people in your religious community who you have opted in to help protect, who you have responsibility under religion to protect. We say these individuals actively put those other people in danger at the point in which they allow someone who they know to commit harmful acts to people within that Catholic Church and allow them to continue to roam free. Secondly, though, we tell you that the child's relationship with that religion is forever tarnished. Another thing the parent cannot decide. Because at the point in which you do not say it is that individual's fault, you are then saying it is the Catholic Church's fault. You tie what happened to them with that religion and with that Catholic Church. That means that that child will never have the type of connection with God that parent might want them to have. That actively harms the child's ability to integrate with that community and with that religion. The third thing that we say is that it shows those, having shown those leaders of the church to be corrupt and self-serving, you are now letting other people within that organisation who genuinely believe that those people represent the tenets of that religion to keep on believing that. We think that harms their ability to work within that religious community. So, Mr. Speaker, these parents, as parents, have obligations to step forward and as members of the state to step forward, but they also have moral obligations as members of a religion within the Catholic Church. And it's for both of these reasons that the decision that they make is a morally corrupt one. If they do not come forward, they do not stand trial.
I'd like to thank Josh for his speech. I will now welcome the second speaker for the negative team, Max.
Madam Speaker, let's make something very clear. We say that when a priest sexually abuses a child, they have absolutely no consideration for that child's well-being. We think when a parent makes a decision to protect a child from the massive legal power of the Catholic Church, from public ostracisation, they put the interests of the child first. We think because of that, there is absolutely no relation between those decisions. One places the child first, one ignores the child. Because of that, all the material they wanted to talk about moral culpability in cases where parents choose to place the interest of their child first was absolutely wrong. What we told you in today's debate, Madam Speaker, was that it was a moral decision for parents to place the needs of their children first. We don't think that children were ever social battering rams. We don't think it was ever reasonable to expect parents to use their children as social battering rams, particularly when they've just gone through the emotional trauma of abuse. I'm going to ask two questions in rebuttal. First one is, what do parents consider when they make these sorts of decisions, which is a point about the characterisation of parents, which we've got from both sides of the debate. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what should they consider, which is going to focus on the collective action problem, which Chandra has already talked about. So, what do parents consider when they make these decisions? We've had a couple of competing characterisations on this point. What that side of the house wanted to tell you was that parents take lots of things into account when they make these decisions, not many of which concern the children. They firstly told you that parents are interested in financial gain when they make their settlements. First of all, we can see that because it's pretty obvious you get money as a result of their settlements. The question then is, why do they want that financial gain? Because what Shane told you and what we got scant response to was that you can use money to help children out in these situations. Firstly, you can employ psychologists to help them get over the trauma of it. Second of all, you can help the family move away from those areas and those toxic cultures which will continue to ostracise the child. Guys, parents making decisions about taking money from an institution which has systematically abused their children for years and using that to help their children is not a bad thing. We're more than happy to stand behind that decision there. We think they probably should consider those things. Second thing they said was that parents consider religious standing when it comes to these things. What we tell you, Madam Speaker, is that there is an extent in time to which we think most parents have a physical and visceral response to these sorts of abuse. To the extent that they've trusted their children to actually bring forward a complaint against the church, considering most children need parental support for these complaints to even go anywhere in the first place, we think these parents are likely to be not considering the religious standing in their own institutions a fair bit. So we actually think the characterisation of parents just wanting to stay good with like the hierarchies of the Catholic Church was absolute nonsense. The third thing they said was that, well, because these people are Catholics and because the Bible condemns paedophilia, they should necessarily, consider that. We think that stands in direct contrast to what they said earlier. We absolutely believe that parents should place the priority and the interests of their children first. We'd say that to the extent which being a good Catholic requires you to go to the police and, prosecute the church, we don't think that that is necessarily a good thing which undermines. We think that does undermine parents' role to protect their children, particularly when they make these decisions. Fourthly, the thing which they talked about was whether or not parents have a duty to other victims of crime and other victims of abuse as a result of keeping these things silent. Let's use their own words here, Madam Speaker. They said that the problem with the status quo was that there wasn't enough widespread and extensive evidence to hold the Catholic Church to account. By definition, one instance of sexual abuse is not widespread or extensive. It doesn't create the massive number of cases you need to solve these problems. So we're not talking about one parent choosing to solve sexual abuse. In many cases, we're not even talking about one parent being able to effectively stop a priest, because as I'm going to tell you a bit later, when you have settlements, when you don't have settlements, there is actually no guarantee during the trial that these things will result in those people not being prosecuted. So we'd actually say in that circumstance that parents should consider their children first. So, second question under this first question. What is the actual nature of the alternative which parents face here? We think that parents do need to consider the nature of the other alternatives they can make when they consider the morality of these decisions and whether or not to make them. So, first thing that they told you is that they acknowledged that the alternative in this debate was mainly trials and was mainly taking kids who had been abused and allowing them to get into a trial format. They then said that that was fine for a couple of reasons. First thing they said was that all the points we wanted to bring to you about the degradation of personal privacy as a result of this were moot because there are protections in trials. First of all, there were protections for those things 20 years ago, so at best this is contemporary. Second of all, we think those protections are scant. You are still required to go before a judge and go before people more senior than you as a child and say, I was hurt in this way. But also during trials, we think if the church wants to deny these things, we think likely you're going to have the priest who did it to you say, no, as a matter of fact, you're lying and we don't trust you. And that is what's happened during a trial, guys. And that happens under your model despite whatever protections you want to talk about here. Second point they raised is that, well, the whole point of a trial process is that people will still think they're at fault. Guys, we think the extent to which you can sign a private settlement, the Catholic Church gives you a lot of money. We think that does ameliorate fault a bit. But secondly, that was entirely reliant on them proving that trials would result in prosecutions in these cases. Shane provided you examples of why it might be in certain situations. The sheer amount of money and legal power the Catholic Church has would defeat this. When you lose a trial on sexual abuse, or when a priest is found in those 94% of interests which currently aren't prosecuted and don't result in criminal charges, we say that then you actually have the state telling children that they are lying and they are to blame for their own situations here. Third point they wanted to raise was ridiculous, that in the future, these kids would blame themselves for other certain, acts of sexual abuse occurring, which we think was antithesis to the other information, which they said, anyway, we think this is tangential at best. I'll leave it to Kirkby to explain more about that later. Second point is what should they consider when they make these sorts of decisions? Their entire point was premised on them proving that there was a benefit to the rest of children in society from parents coming forward with information. First of all, what we told you was that parents aren't the victims in this, children are, and we'd say that it is wrong, therefore, if there's any situations for a parent to mandate their child does something when they themselves experience benefit out of them. But secondly, we always disputed this idea that necessarily collective action was a factor in this debate. We always told you that the actual benefit of one particular case going forward, of one particular case going out into the spotlight, was never really proven. It was nebulous and it was tangential. Because here's the thing, Madam Speaker, we'd say that to the extent you need cultural change within these organisations, that comes when you have lots and lots and lots of people going forward, not necessarily just one. It is unclear if there is any benefit at all of one person moving forward when you change the sorts of structural factors which protect pedophile priests in the first place. I'm going to move on to my substanding now. I'm going to talk about that even taking their case at its best, where these things would result in public settlements where the Catholic Church just throws up their ears and says, do you know what, go and name the priest. That would still be worse in many situations for people. And therefore why it would be moral and appropriate for parents to make the decision about confidential settlements. Here's what we say here. We'd say that the Catholic Church currently places a premium on the privacy of its priests when it settles these trials. We think the most obvious application then of a private settlement as opposed to a public settlement, which doesn't involve a trial, is that under private settlements people get more money because they can always demand that they will go forward and go that in the future. So we'd say that there is necessarily more money for the people involved in their situations. We think in certain situations it might be perfectly appropriate for parents to weigh up that financial gain against the other harms we wanted to talk about. But secondly, even if there was no extra money, we'd say that even without trials, you can still have social backlash about publicly accusing a priest or a various agent of the Catholic Church of sexual abuse, and we'd say that parents do need to weigh this up. Thirdly, we'd say that when you are talked about in public as an abuse victim, we'd say that in many situations you become a conversation piece instead of a person. You encourage people in the community to look at you as a victim and define all of your characteristics by that particular thing. In many ways you lose the power to control your own identity in that particular position. We're not saying that's 100% appropriate in every situation, but it occurs enough that parents have a right to consider it when they make these decisions. Fourthly, we'd say that sometimes parents need to factor the willingness of the children to go through with these trials in the first instance. So there might actually be situations where parents need to weigh up the possibility of that child being able to go before a court later on in the future, or being able to go and publicly name someone as a pedophile. We'd say that if this is the best case scenario in these situations, parents should make the decision. Because we never thought it was appropriate to compare parents who want to protect their children to pedophiles who want to sexually abuse them. We have very, very practical posts.
And we'll now welcome the third speaker, Jessica, to close this substantive block of the Madam Speaker, this is a debate about the actions of parents who, instead of letting their child access the criminal justice system, have chosen instead to hide their children's suffering for monetary gain. We believe that the question of this debate must come down to whether their decision was in fact a moral one. And we say morality has to be weighed against aspects such as what was best for the child, what was best for future victims, and what was best for the state in being able to prosecute these crimes. We say on all fronts the benefits fall to the affirmative team. With that in mind, I'll ask two questions. Firstly, what was actually the calculus for the parents in this case? Was it an honourable one in which they were protecting their child, or was it a decision that was influenced by selfish reasons? And then secondly, if parents chose to actually let their children prosecute this case, would it be a beneficial one? Would it actually have benefits for those children? On to this first question. What was the prime motivator for parents in these cases? We heard from the negative team firstly that the trial is damaging to children itself because it harms them, it exposes their privacy, and it has people in society, label them in a certain way, and it has the effect of the Catholic Church basically, potentially, abusing this child. We had a few responses. Firstly, we told you that almost every jurisdiction in most countries, their identity of children is almost always protected in cases where children are involved. We told you that as a result, it was going to be extremely unlikely that the identity of children in these cases would be released. We heard in response that while the Catholic Church would just leak this identity to the public, well, in that case, the state would probably impose consequences on the Catholic Church for doing it, because that would be the law, and they would naturally have an incentive not to break that law. We then told you that we think it's actually better for children to have an openness about this and not to be isolated by their parents and kept in this insular environment where they're told, don't tell anyone about it, don't tell anyone about it, you should just keep it to yourself and shut up. We think that is absolutely disgusting, and we would much rather children perhaps go through years of what we acknowledge, yes, will probably be very emotional damage that they suffer. But we would, at the end of the day, rather they come out of that stronger. We would rather them learn to deal with these issues and learn to face their problems through dealing with psychologists, through dealing with those things. We'd rather them not be told by their parents that they shouldn't be open about it, that they shouldn't tell people. We think it is one of the most damaging things to children to be told to not confide their issues with other people, and we think it's much better for children to be open about this. But the third thing we told you is that it is known fundamentally within the criminal justice system that there are benefits to trials in and of itself. The first thing Josh told you was that in that case the state is prosecuting the perpetrator, and in that case the state is saying that this person should be looked at as guilty and should be found guilty. So I think it has the effect of telling children that what they did wasn't wrong, and that the burden falls on the perpetrator in this case. They said though, what happens if they're not convicted? In that case they said, well, children will feel like it was their fault and that they didn't have a substantive case. Madam Speaker, we acknowledge that it would be far better for the priests who committed these crimes to be convicted, and we acknowledge that the benefit of that would be better than them not being convicted. But that's not the contrast in this debate. The contrast is them not being convicted, or like never having the chance to be convicted in the first place, because there is absolutely no way of that evidence being brought to the court. We think it would still be better to lose a trial than to never have that evidence reach the light of day, because at the very least it brings alarm bells for other people in society to know that this priest may be a danger to society, and at least the parents in this case can know that morally they assisted with that and perhaps warned other parents against those harms. So this is a contrast between that priest not being convicted after a trial and that priest never, ever, ever having to face justice because what that parent did was tell their child that they should never bring that to the forefront. They said parents were in the best place to know was what their future child would want. But Madam Speaker, we say that it's not for parents to make decisions that would harm their child. That's why we would say that you shouldn't let Jehovah's Witnesses deny their children medical treatment when they could die. In this case, we'd say it is never the right calculus of parents to be able to deny them access to the criminal justice system. But we think, let's take on their burden, Madam Speaker. Let's analyse what this future child would want. We think this future child would, child in the future when they've grown up, would probably rather have had that trial, would rather have seen the ability for their perpetrator to face criminal justice. We think that future child would much rather see that perpetrator be seen in a trial process. We think that it is fundamentally not true that that child would rather their parents just say, let's leave it, let's let it go away. In contrast, what do we tell you? We told you that parents had fundamentally selfish motivators for wanting to put this issue behind them. We told you that there was monetary gain. They told us, but no, that monetary gain would be used for counselling. We say, Madam Speaker, there are counselling services provided by the state under the status quo. We don't think it is necessary for monetary gain to be received in this instance because we think parents know that the state does provide them services when they face these harms. We think that's fundamentally true. But we heard an agreement from the negative team, secondly, that yes, parents would lose their standing in the church. And they said that that was something that would be bad for the child. No, Madam Speaker, that would be bad for the parents because they would lose that standing in the church and they wouldn't be able to then have that relationship with the church. We think this was a fundamentally selfish thing to value, especially when Josh told you and Pete told you that there was no religious value to their actions, that it fundamentally went against Scripture. The last thing we told you was that when parents do this, they receive a label of being a bad parent because they let their child hang around with pedophiles, essentially. We had no response to that. So on to this second question. Would this decision be actually beneficial? They said there'd be no guarantee of conviction because there's a culture of silence that exists. We had a few responses. Firstly, yes, guys, that is part of the problem. The reason why we have a culture of silence is because the priests pay their victims not to speak. That is part of the problem, and you guys don't do anything to solve that. But we tell you, yes, we actually think these priests are likely to be convicted. At the point in which a person provides evidence and testimony to a court that that priest raped them or molested them, we think it's reasonably likely that that person would be convicted. But thirdly, to the extent that that didn't even happen, at the very least, we think this reveals information that can lead to more prosecutions happening in the future. They then said this wouldn't be helpful to future victims and other children who could potentially be victimised in this instance. We say, yes, it is, because at the point in which a priest is convicted for pedophilia and for those actions, that directly prevents the next child who could be their victim being a victim of that. We think that's fundamentally good. But even again, if they weren't convicted, at the very least, this labels that person as a potential pedophile. It means that parents will probably be more cautious about letting their children hang around with that priest, or that might raise other warning bells that see other priests in that church get investigated. We think at the very minimum that is a good thing and a calculus that parents should be making. We told you though that parents had an obligation to children and to all children, because as a parent they understood the vulnerability of children and had an obligation to all children. We then heard from second, there's no benefits because even if they're convicted, money could be more beneficial than justice. We told you that justice will always be more important, though it
can't have a monetary value. We tell you that the benefits of having a child seek the criminal justice system was an important one. Then we heard from Stephen, well, you know what? There might be a benefit to not having people in society look at you weird because you're a victim. We think fundamentally it is important for society to know if you're a victim, because it means they have a context for the way you might live in society. We think fundamentally that means that people can be sympathetic to you and help you and provide you assistance. We don't think the idea that society might look at you weird simply holds up in this debate. Madam Speaker, at the end of this debate, the decision that these parents made was fundamentally immoral, and we proudly oppose.
So rude. I'd like to thank Beth for her speech, and we'll now welcome Daniel to close the exam.
Does my moral obligation to all the victims of abuse only kick in at the point at which I'm a victim of abuse, Madam Speaker? Because this is what I thought was the most perverse part of their case. It said at the point at which you were unlucky enough to have the huge harm and suffering of abuse put upon you. Do you know what other huge harm and suffering you have to put upon you? The moral framework that demands that you use yourself as a tool or a pawn in a game of chess against the Catholic Church. That is messed up. We would say that the point at which you should be most entitled to insulate yourself from harm, the point at which you are most entitled to be self-interested under a moral framework is at the point at which you yourself are a victim of abuse. That is the point at which you should be entitled to, as a parent or a child, value your interests, your life experience, and your ability to do things like access mental and physical safety in the long run above all other moral considerations, Madam Speaker. Their moral framework was messed up from the first place because it put the most moral impetus on the people who were most vulnerable in their society. Or alternatively, it demanded that you and I in this room right now quit debating altogether and just spend the rest of our life doing nothing but prosecuting the Catholic Church, because apparently self-interest and valuing your own life experience is morally wrong and no one is ever allowed or entitled to do that under their moral system. We would say that is messed up. I have 3 questions to ask in this debate. Firstly, can courts protect victims, which I guarantee you I'll get through very, very quickly. Secondly, does this decision being made by parents change anything? And thirdly, are you allowed to insulate yourself from being a tool of true that in all circumstances courts can protect the privacy of victims? They needed to concede that in this debate. But secondly, we gave you a whole other list of things that could happen in a court trial. I really liked in Josh's speech when he talked about victim narratives. Something that's really important is that when you are a victim, you are exposed to a narrative which says that the person on the other side is morally culpable. Because here's a thought, guys. 20 years ago, there was no possible consideration that a fancy defense lawyer could possibly, in that trial, say, you know what, kid, it's your fault. That sort of thing never happened 20 years ago. Victim blaming was unheard of 20 years ago, Madam Speaker. That is a narrative they necessarily have to concede that they will sometime expose kids to. We would say even if courts could protect your privacy, which wasn't true 20 years ago in Northern Ireland in closed-in local communities, but even if they could, the process of a court trial itself can be necessarily and structurally harmful. Just putting someone on trial can force them to relive and engage in abuse in a way that is fundamentally damaging to their personality, especially at the point at which the Catholic Church can afford to buy the fanciest defense lawyers who will be the best at constructing a narrative that either blames the child and victim blames them or manages to expunge them of moral culpability. In that regards, trials are morally abhorrent to force parents to take their children to. So, does a parent making this decision on behalf of their child say anything? This was their logic, right? Some of these children will want to grow up and wish they had prosecuted in the first instance, and in that regard, parents are morally wrong. But here's our problem with them. Some of the children under their model who would have been forced to go to trial will grow up wishing their parents had never forced them to trial. We conceded, because we were the accurate and honest team in this debate, that right from the beginning, because they were children and we couldn't necessarily trust them to make adult decisions about the legal system, some of them would grow up to regret what happened. That is true under both teams' models and is unavoidable when you talk about parents sitting with their children. The question then becomes, should parents prioritise the stability and safety and certainty that is a private settlement, or the potential idea down the road that some children had wished they had been made tools of the state. We would say parents have to prioritise the former, Mr. Speaker. Parents' prima facie moral duty to children is to protect them from harm, and that exists to the exclusion of other children around them. We would say the bond that these guys acknowledge that is special between parent and child means parents should always value that immediate short-term harm beyond the long-term nebulous concept that my child might possibly grow up to regret the fact they weren't exposed to a trial. But why did parents make this decision? They wanted to paint parents as inherently selfish. The first thing I want to point out in this debate is we do not have to defend every instance of parents making these decisions. So if parents did genuinely make these decisions because they were selfish, we told you it's shame we wouldn't defend that. But what we tell you is in the real world, the vast majority of these decisions were made because the parents prioritised the interests of their particular children, and we were more than happy to stand behind that 100% in this debate, mostly because it is the real world. We would say parents love their children, they care for their children, they spend every waking moment with their children, they went through the pain of childbirth with that child in the instance of mothers, therefore we think they will always value that experience of child. So why do they have the right to value that experience of child above all others? What did we hear from them? Well, Josh told us these parents were literally enabling the Catholic Church. They were helping the Catholic Church. Bull crap. They are prioritising the existence of the children. They are not giving lawyers to the pedophiles. They are not giving money to the pedophiles to defend themselves. It is absolutely abhorrent that your moral system says if you choose to value your child, you are helping a pedophile. That is a messed up moral framework, and we think it's the moral framework Josh fell into at second. But what did we say is in reality? They told us that parents had a moral responsibility to all future victims. We tell you this. That cannot be possibly true in this debate. Here's why. Firstly, because parents can't possibly understand the way this policy will play out in the future. They cannot calculate the interests of future victims. They cannot understand it. Pedophiles might have a moral duty to not create victims in the future. We fully concede that as a real moral duty. But the assumption that parents have to prioritise all and every victim in society above their child is abhorrent and a terrible moral system. We told you that strict utilitarianism can't possibly operate here because it destroys the life experience of some of the most vulnerable people in our society and is abhorrent in its application in this debate. What else do we tell you? We tell you parents can make these decisions for all sorts of meaningful and rational reasons. Let's take their case at their best. Parents make this decision because they want to value the money or those sort of things above the risk of a trial. We would tell you in this debate that justice isn't absolute and that moral frameworks and systems should recognise that consistently and constantly. Because the biggest problem I have with their moral framework at the end of this debate is it tells victims which things they should value in this debate. They should value justice above their ability to move away from an abusive community. They should value justice above their capacity to purchase a psychologist. The only response we got was that, don't worry, the state provides free psychologists. That's not even fucking true in Northern Ireland a lot of the time, Madam Speaker, so it's absolutely abhorrent. They condemn poor Northern Irish families to take the risk that they might possibly get some form of compensation in a trial 3 years later. We tell you this, people have a right and a moral right, and it is a legitimate moral decision to value the guarantee of the financial compensation and the guarantee that the church will admit they've done something wrong because that is necessarily in a closed circuit. They force children to be exposed to a situation in which we cannot predict the outcome, in which those children will be exposed to a narrative of victim blaming and are very likely to be abused by defence counsels. They force poor families to give up a guarantee and a meaningful set of circumstances that they could use to benefit their situation right now for nebulous claims that we're not even sure. Finally, does this help prosecutions? Let's be clear, Madam Speaker. Physical abuse of school children at Northern Irish Catholic schools was publicly known. There was no culture of silence around physical abuse of children in Northern Ireland Catholic schools. The problem we have with their case, right, is there is no guarantee that just because you break a culture of silence, you necessarily enable the state to prosecute the Catholic Church. And we think they conceded that when they explained the extent to which the Catholic Church has power. We think they were grossly insufficient in establishing why more complaints and more prosecutions would necessarily result in optimal outcomes. At best, their moral framework treats children who are victims of abuse as moral pawns in a game of chess against a monolithic structure they have no chance to beat. We are okay with them valuing their immediate, short-term and guaranteed interests above all else, Madam Speaker. We were proud to stand in opposition.
conscript 3-year-olds to march against the century-strong walls of the Catholic Church? 2 questions in summary. 1. Are private settlements rational moral decisions? And 2. Are children tools of the state? And if they are, will they ever be effective ones? Are private settlements rational moral decisions? We told you 3 things in this debate. 1. We told you that you had a right to privacy when abuse is visited upon you through no fault of your own. You can choose to avoid public ostracism, psychological harm, and a harrowing trial. 2. We told you that the guarantee of money would be the best thing for recovery when you could buy counselling, when you could move away from oppressive societies in some cases. And 3. We told you that a brave parent can't translate that bravery upon their 3-year-old and force him to risk his future. We heard a few things in response. Firstly, we heard that the trial isn't that damaging, guys. We had 2 responses. Firstly, we told you that the adversarial nature of that trial means that priests never make the admissions that their case relied on. Instead, they would point fingers at that child to the bitter end. But secondly, we told you that the trial itself meant that the child had to revisit the most harrowing experience of their life for weeks and months over and over again, and nothing they did could avoid that. Secondly, they told us that there was this moral obligation to help victims in future. Once again, 2 responses. Firstly, we told you that the lottery of abuse didn't bring with it the responsibility of joining the state in their fight against that abuse, but also that it was incredibly pernicious that the harm of that abuse brought with it the harm of becoming a state tool and being dragged through a trial. But secondly, we told you that there was no guarantee at all that you would help out the state cause when you yourself told us in your case that the church had lots and lots of money and largesse to protect themselves against that trial. And finally, they told us that the courts could provide privacy. But we told you that that wasn't universal. There was no guarantee of that privacy. But there was a guarantee of money to buy counselling, money to buy safety, and money to buy recovery. But also, we told you that even if your identity was private, the court trial itself was structurally harmful when the lawyers create a narrative of victim blaming to win that trial. Second issue, are children tools of the state? And if they are, would they be effective? We told you 4 things. 1, we told you that any moral framework that demanded parents throw their children as hammers and nails against the wall of the church in the hope that theirs is the one that brings that wall down is not one we should stand for. 2, we told you you can't morally blame a century-long culture of silence on any one children for choosing to protect their child. 3, we told you that even if you didn't believe any of our other arguments, we've known about sexual abuse in the church for decades and decades, and even the state doesn't know what it will take to bring down that wall and bring down that structure of violence. And 4, we explained that if you had to go to public trials and that was the norm, people would just not come forward and you would lose all the benefits on your side. A few responses. They told us that it would be gutless and selfish not to. But firstly, we told you that it was never about the guts of that parents. It was only ever about the guts of the children that we can't know about until they've grown up. And secondly, we told you that even if you really, really badly wanted to fight the church, the most selfless thing for you to do in that circumstance was to give up that fight that you want to pursue for the sake of protecting your child because of that special duty that you owe that child as a parent. And finally, they told us that some children will want justice in future. We had 3 responses. Firstly, which ones? You didn't know that, we didn't know that, most importantly, the parents didn't know that. That means that necessarily your policy means you'll be forcing some children into that fight when they didn't want to be. Secondly, we said that you can't tell people to value your idea of state justice over the guaranteed compensation and their personal justice that they could acquire under our model. And finally, we told you that parents would never prioritize faceless, nameless potential victims in the future over their trial, especially when they didn't know if those victims would be safe anyway. We oppose.
Thank you, Shane, and we'll now invite back Josh to give you
This was never a question of whether children should be a battering ram as a tool of state. It was a question about whether, in a difficult situation of a parent, about whether to actively help facilitate the Catholic Church covering up crimes that you know to have committed, or to go forward and to actively help fight that fight against that church, that we should always prioritise going forward against that church. We told you that it was best for the child, we told you that parents owe broad obligations to society, and we told you that parents owe broad obligations to the church. The 3 frameworks of this debate. On trials, they told us their entire case more or less rested on the idea that children were worse off in trials. We gave you a few responses to this. We told you firstly that children's privacy in almost all jurisdictions are absolute, that children do not have to be in the courtroom, they do not ever have to face their accuser, and that their identity itself could be hidden. They told us not always. But we told you that even if there was some trade-offs of identity, they would be able to deal with that in the future. What children would never be able to deal with, we told you, was that of losing the opportunity to be able to face their prosecutor. We told you that parents were unable to deal with that. The second thing, though, that we told you is that there is a guilt and blame scenario that occurs when you do not ever face that prosecutor and when you know that they're going to be going around committing worse atrocities. They told us that they get to stay silent, right? We told you, the pedophiles will blame them in court. Well, we told you that pedophile blame and victim blame occurs on both sides of the house. But what you guys do is told the victims that they have to stay silent. That to come forward and say that what happened to them was wrong is in itself something that is blameworthy. You changed the calculus of parents, we said, from being on the victim's side in this debate to telling the victims to never talk about the offence that occurred to them again. We told you that was a horrific outcome for the victim. We also told you that if nothing else, even if they don't get found guilty, at least the child then knows that they have people who are fighting for them, that what occurred to them is wrong. We told you that was extraordinarily important. We also told you on a community level that the reason why parents go into this is because they didn't want to lose standing within their own community. The negative team advocated that as something that was a rational choice. But what we told you was that the children who were the victims of this debate, the community would always be worse off. Because you have firstly kept them in a community in which they will always have perpetuated harms against them, that have covered up the harms against them. You keep children in a Catholic church now, which is told them to be silent against offences that occurred. We told you that was a selfish calculus for parents to make. We also told you that they would never be able to trust that community again, and that in terms of the child's own religious development, if that's the calculus someone's making this debate, that child would always be worse off, because now they cannot equate that religious experience to the thing that occurred to them. No response on the negative team. We also told you, though, that parents are more likely to make this because of other factors. We told you that they are actively taking money in exchange for silence. They're not simply agreeing to be silent. That means that money played an active part in their moral calculus, Mr. Speaker. We told you taking money for that trade-off was inhumane. We lastly told you then that even if none of that's true, it is the parents' choice, Mr. Speaker, that they trade their justice for reputation and protection. We told you that was illegitimate for a parent to do. Second issue, we told you that they ignore obligations to society. We told you that hundreds of thousands of children have been molested, Madam Speaker, that pedophilia always ends in more victims being blamed and victims coming forward. That was the framework of this debate. They told us that there is no moral obligation. We told you, Madam Speaker, that it's not an act of mission calculus. That by taking money, you are actively agreeing to hide the church. That makes you actively culpable in the harms that that church takes on. Kirkby's new materials that, we don't actively give them money. No, you actively accept it. We also told you, Madam Speaker, that you owe broader obligations to the church. We put this in the framework of a religious individual with a religious identity. We said even if you don't owe obligations to society as a whole, you definitely owe obligations to people within that community that you opted in to have a moral framework around. We told you, Madam Speaker, that you allow a hierarchy that no longer propounds the tenets of that Bible, and you allow other people in that community to continue to live under that hierarchy, and you allow the children of that community to continue to be molested by priests who just move around to other communities. That is morally despicable. At the end of this debate, Madam Speaker, parents do have one or two active choices to make. We propose that they act on the side of justice.
I'd like to thank all the speakers for their speeches. If we could give them another round of applause, that would be great. My understanding is results will be announced in the briefing room where